To understand World War II, we have to begin before 1939, in the unstable peace that followed World War I. The previous war ended with huge destruction, but not with a shared political settlement that all major societies accepted as legitimate. In Europe, resentment grew around borders, reparations, minority populations, and competing national claims. At the same time, the global economy experienced severe shocks, including the Great Depression, which weakened democratic institutions and made extremist movements look, to many people, like decisive alternatives. In this atmosphere, fascist ideology expanded in Europe, while militarist nationalism deepened in Japan. These movements shared several features. They glorified expansion, dismissed compromise as weakness, and treated war as a tool for national renewal. So the conflict that emerged in 1939 was not a sudden accident. It was the result of years of political radicalization, institutional failure, and aggressive revisionism. The early warning signs were visible. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, demonstrating that territorial conquest could succeed with limited immediate pushback. The Spanish Civil War became a brutal testing ground for ideology, tactics, and foreign intervention. In Asia, the Second Sino-Japanese War widened violence and showed how quickly regional war could become entangled with global rivalries. In Europe, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler remilitarized, annexed Austria, and then absorbed the Sudetenland. Each step shifted the strategic balance and eroded confidence in collective security. Diplomacy continued, but it increasingly operated under coercion rather than trust. The formal start came on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war, but the crisis immediately became more complex because the Soviet Union also entered Poland from the east in mid-September. Under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Poland was partitioned. That moment reveals a key pattern of the early war. Ideology mattered, but so did tactical state interests and temporary arrangements between future enemies. By the end of 1939, what looked like another European war was already tied to larger geopolitical fault lines. The institutions meant to prevent another catastrophe had failed to deter escalation, and the mechanisms of total war, industrial mobilization, mass displacement, and ideological violence, were already beginning to form. The stage was set for a conflict that would exceed previous assumptions about scale, speed, and human cost. From 1939 to mid-1941, the war transformed from a fast series of regional campaigns into a multi-theater struggle. Germany overran much of continental Europe with alarming speed, defeating Poland and then, in 1940, conquering Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands before France fell in June. These victories were not just territorial gains, they shifted industrial capacity, transport networks, and strategic depth toward the Axis. At the same time, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states and seized parts of Finland and Romania, showing that power politics was redrawing borders across Eastern Europe. The conflict's center of gravity kept moving, and every move expanded the number of civilians exposed to occupation, forced labor, and repression. After France fell, many expected Britain to be isolated into submission. Instead, the war entered a different phase. The Battle of Britain and the Blitz demonstrated the new centrality of air power. Strategic bombing brought the front line into cities, factories, and homes, blurring the distinction between combatant and civilian experience. Night after night, civilians endured destruction that was tactical in military terms but psychological in social terms. Parallel to this, the Battle of the Atlantic became a long economic lifeline struggle. If shipping failed, Britain's ability to fight would collapse. So even before the war became fully global, it was already total in character, fought across skies, seas, production systems, and civilian morale. Axis expansion also spread into the Balkans, Mediterranean, Middle East, and East Africa, drawing colonial troops and resources into a widening chain of campaigns. Then in June 1941 came a decisive escalation. Germany invaded the Soviet Union, opening the Eastern Front. This was one of history's most consequential military decisions. It turned the war into a colossal land struggle of distance, climate, industrial output, and attrition. It also intensified ideological violence at a massive scale, including policies tied to racial hierarchy and annihilation. By late 1941, the war was already continental in Europe and transregional in Africa and the Middle East. But one event would complete its transformation into a truly global conflict: Japan's decision to attack American and British targets, including Pearl Harbor, in December 1941. With that, the United States entered the war, and separate theaters fused into one integrated world war. Once the United States entered in December 1941, World War II became an interconnected global system rather than a set of parallel wars. Japan rapidly captured large areas of coastal China and Southeast Asia, threatening sea lanes, colonial administrations, and resource supplies across the Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. For a brief period, Axis momentum looked overwhelming. But by 1942 and 1943, a sequence of turning points began to reverse that trajectory. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was pivotal. It did not end the war, but it changed strategic momentum by halting Japanese expansion and damaging carrier strength that was difficult to replace quickly. Midway matters because naval aviation had become decisive. Control of carriers increasingly meant control of operational reach across vast ocean spaces. In North Africa, Axis defeats disrupted the possibility of linking strategic pressure across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad became the emblem of attritional reversal. The battle's military significance lay in enormous losses and the destruction of a major German field army, but its political and psychological impact was equally profound. It demonstrated that Axis offensives could be broken and rolled back. These reversals did not produce immediate victory. They created a new phase in which Allied advantages in industry, logistics, intelligence coordination, and coalition management grew more visible. In 1943, the Allies invaded Italy, leading to the collapse of its fascist regime. Although fighting continued in Italy, the Axis coalition had fractured at a political level. In the Soviet theater, Red Army offensives increasingly pushed westward. In the Pacific, the United States and its allies advanced through costly island campaigns while degrading Japan's naval and air capabilities. What changed in this middle period was not just maps, but war economics and time horizons. Axis powers faced shrinking options, resource strain, and mounting replacement problems. The Allies, despite internal disagreements, increasingly synchronized production and operations across theaters. War became a contest of endurance under industrial conditions. Fuel, shipping, steel, trained crews, and repair capacity mattered as much as battlefield brilliance. By 1944, the strategic initiative had clearly shifted. The Axis still fought fiercely, but the direction of the war was now set by Allied offensives on nearly every front. In 1944 and 1945, the war entered its final and most destructive closing phase. In Western Europe, the Allied landings at Normandy opened a major front that accelerated the liberation of German-occupied territory. In the East, Soviet offensives advanced through Central and Eastern Europe with immense force and staggering human cost. Germany now faced converging pressure from both directions, while strategic bombing had already damaged transportation and industrial systems. Military defeat became increasingly unavoidable, but collapse was not instantaneous. Urban warfare, scorched earth retreat, and ideological fanaticism prolonged the violence. The end in Europe came with the fall of Berlin and Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. Yet victory in Europe did not end the global conflict. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan continued fighting despite severe losses, including the crippling of its navy and the loss of key islands. By mid-1945, Allied planners faced the prospect of continued large-scale combat if a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands occurred. Against this backdrop, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9. The Soviet Union also invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Together, these events compressed Japan's strategic options and accelerated surrender, which was announced on August 15 and formally signed on September 2, 1945. The end of the war brought relief and trauma in equal measure. World War II was the deadliest conflict in history, with roughly 60 to 75 million deaths. The toll included combat casualties and vast civilian losses from massacres, starvation, disease, and genocidal policies, including the Holocaust. The Holocaust stands as one of the central moral catastrophes of modern history, industrialized, state-driven extermination carried out under ideological dehumanization. Understanding the war without centering civilian suffering produces a distorted narrative. After surrender, occupation and accountability followed. Germany, Austria, Japan, and Korea entered post-war occupation frameworks. Major Axis leaders were tried for war crimes, establishing legal precedents that shaped later international criminal law debates. So the war ended not simply with ceasefires, but with a contested attempt to define responsibility, rebuild states, and prevent recurrence. The battlefield phase was over, the political reconstruction phase had begun. World War II did not just change borders, it reordered global power, institutions, and social expectations for decades. One immediate consequence was the creation of the United Nations, designed to reduce the chance of another systemic war through structured international cooperation. Its Security Council reflected the wartime balance of power, with China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States as permanent members. This arrangement institutionalized both cooperation and hierarchy. It gave major powers a shared forum, while also embedding rivalry inside the system. That rivalry soon became the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged as superpowers with incompatible political and economic visions, global military reach, and competing alliance networks. In that sense, 1945 was both an ending and a beginning. The ideological confrontation that followed was not a direct continuation of World War II, but it grew from wartime outcomes, occupation zones, security dilemmas, reconstruction priorities, and competing interpretations of legitimacy. Europe, once the center of global imperial power, was materially and politically exhausted. As influence waned, decolonization accelerated across Asia and Africa. Colonized societies leveraged the language of self-determination and the weakened capacity of European empires to sustain control. Post-war reconstruction also drove new economic models, from state-led planning to welfare expansion and international financial coordination. Countries with damaged industries pursued recovery through modernization, trade realignment, and infrastructure rebuilding. The war's technological and moral legacy was equally profound. Air power, mechanized warfare, intelligence systems, and nuclear weapons transformed strategic thinking. The atomic bombings introduced a permanent question into international politics: how to prevent annihilatory weapons from being used again. At the same time, memory of genocide and mass civilian targeting reshaped human rights discourse, historical scholarship, and public education. So why study World War II now? Because many structures of the present world, security institutions, alliance patterns, legal norms, and debates over sovereignty, intervention, and war crimes, were forged in its aftermath. The conflict demonstrates how quickly regional crises can fuse into global catastrophe when deterrence fails, institutions weaken, and dehumanizing ideologies gain state power. It also shows that rebuilding after total war is possible, but never automatic. The core lesson is not that history repeats on schedule, it is that political choices, institutional resilience, and civic vigilance determine whether escalation is contained or allowed to consume the world.